It had been 2 years since Thomas lost Margaret, yet the house still whispered her presence. Her handwriting lingered in recipe cards tucked inside kitchen drawers. Her scent faintly clung to the old wool cardigan hanging by the coat rack, and the faint echo of her laughter seemed to follow him whenever he crossed the hallway. Friends told him to move on, but Thomas had learned that grief was not a door you simply closed, was a room you learned to live inside. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he decided to climb up into the attic, a place he'd avoided since her passing. Dust floated lazily in the narrow shafts of light that pierced through the wooden boards, and the air smelled of cedar and thyme. There, under a stack of faded quilts, sat the old wooden chest they had inherited from Margaret's mother. Thomas remembered Margaret calling it the keeper of little secrets. She used to sit on the floor beside it for hours, sifting through letters, postcards, and tiny trinkets from her childhood. As he opened the chest, the familiar creak of its hinges filled the silence. Inside lay a jumble of family photographs, yellowed birthday cards, and a bundle of pressed flowers tied with blue ribbon. But when Thomas ran his hand along the inside wall, he felt something strange, a thin, uneven ridge. Curious, he pushed gently, and a small wooden panel slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment inside. Wrapped in brittle parchment was an envelope. The paper had aged to a deep cream, its edges curled. Across the front, in Margaret's elegant script, were the words, "To the man I have never met, but think of every day." Thomas froze. The handwriting was undeniably hers, but the words felt like an intrusion into a part of her life he had never known. His heart began to thud, not from the climb up the attic ladder, but from a sudden and inexplicable fear that this letter, forgotten and hidden away, might tell a story he was never meant to hear. He turned the envelope over in his hands, torn between leaving it untouched and opening a door to a truth that might change everything. Asterisk, Thomas sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the envelope heavy in his hands despite its paper-thin weight. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, listening to the rain patter softly on the roof above. His fingers traced the loops and curves of Margaret's handwriting. He had always loved the elegance of her script, the way her letters seemed to dance across the page. But now, those graceful lines felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone he hadn't truly known. He slid a finger under the brittle flap and slowly broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet, the ink slightly faded but still clear. Began to read, "Dear Father, I don't know if you're alive or if you would even care to hear from me, but I have thought of you every day of my life." Thomas's breath caught. Father, Margaret had always spoken about her parents in the simplest of terms. Her mother, Eleanor, had raised her alone, and her father had died young. She never gave details, and Thomas, respecting her privacy, never pressed. But here was a letter clearly meant for a man who was neither dead nor forgotten. Margaret's words spilled across the page in a tone Thomas had rarely seen from her, vulnerable, almost pleading. She spoke of growing up watching other children with their fathers, wondering why hers was absent. She described birthdays spent staring at the front door, hoping he might appear. Yet there was no bitterness in her writing. Instead, there was a quiet longing and, strangely, forgiveness. "I don't know the circumstances that kept you away," the letter read, "but I want you to know I don't hate you. I just wish I could have heard your voice even once." Thomas lowered the page, his mind racing. Why had Margaret never sent this? Why hide it in a secret compartment? And why keep it all these years without ever speaking of it? He searched the rest of the hidden space, found only a small black and white photograph of a young man in a military uniform, smiling faintly at the camera. On the back, in faded pencil, were the words, "James Whitaker, 1965. The name meant nothing to Thomas, but the date and the uniform told him this man could very well be Margaret's father. He slipped the photograph into his pocket, feeling a strange mix of determination and unease. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret as she was when they first met bright-eyed, quick to laugh, but now layered with questions he'd never thought to ask. He wondered if she had intended for him to find the letter someday, or if it was a piece of her past she had hoped would remain forever hidden. By morning, the decision was made. He would try to find this James Whittaker if he was still alive. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it would lead to nothing. But if Margaret had carried this longing all her life, Thomas felt compelled to carry it the rest of the way. He didn't yet know that the search for James Whittaker would uncover far more than just the story of a missing father. Thomas began his search the following morning at the local library, where the smell of old books and quiet concentration reminded him of the afternoons he and Margaret used to spend reading side by side. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman in her 70s with a knack for digging up obscure records. "I'm looking for someone named James Whittaker," Thomas explained, sliding the photograph across the desk. "Possibly military, around the mid-1960s. Mrs. Patterson peered at the picture, adjusting her glasses. "Well, we can start with local enlistment records and newspaper archives. But if he wasn't from here, it might be trickier." Hours passed as Thomas combed through microfilm reels, squinting at grainy headlines. Most leads were dead ends. Whittaker was a common enough name, and the trail grew cold quickly. But just before he was about to give up, Mrs. Patterson returned with a small stack of yellowed newspapers. "This might be something," she said, tapping a 1972 article. The headline read, "Local veteran injured in factory fire." Beneath it was a photograph older than the one in Thomas's pocket, but unmistakably the same man. The article mentioned that James Whittaker had served in Vietnam, returned home, and was working at a manufacturing plant when an accident left him with severe burns. It also stated he had moved to a neighboring state shortly afterward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Thomas copied the article and drove home, his mind churning with questions. Had the injury been why he disappeared from Margaret's life? Or was there more? Back at home, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, entering the name into public records databases. After hours of sifting through addresses, he found a listing for a James Whittaker in a small town 3 hours away. No phone number, just a post office box. Thomas considered writing a letter, but something in him resisted. He didn't want to risk being ignored or dismissed through words on paper. This was personal. He needed to look this man in the eyes. The next morning, under a pale winter sky, Thomas drove to the town. It was the kind of place where the main street had only one traffic light and everyone seemed to know everyone else. At the post office, he approached the counter where a middle-aged clerk greeted him warmly. "I'm trying to reach James Whittaker," Coma said cautiously. "I believe he has a P.O. box here." The clerk shook her head. "Sorry, can't give out personal details. Privacy rules." Thomas was about to thank her and leave when she added, "But if you're looking for Jim Whittaker, you might try the old Miller farm on County Road 9. Folks say he's been renting a room out there for years." Thomas's pulse quickened. He thanked her and followed the directions, the road narrowing until it became a gravel path lined with bare oak trees. Eventually, a weathered farmhouse came into view, its paint peeling, but its windows warm with light dot. An older woman answered the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You must be looking for Jim," she said, as if she'd been expecting him. "He's out back in the shed." Thomas hesitated, his hand tightening on the photograph in his coat pocket. He had imagined this moment for hours, yet now that it was here, a wave of doubt washed over him. What would he say? "Oh, I'm your son-in-law, and my wife's your daughter has been gone 2 years. But before he could reconsider, the woman stepped aside, pointing toward the backyard. The shed door was open, and inside, a tall, thin man with graying hair stood hunched over a workbench. His hands were rough, his face lined not just with age, but with years of something heavier loss, perhaps. When he turned, their eyes met, and Thomas felt an odd shiver. It wasn't recognition, exactly, it was something deeper. a quiet understanding that this man carried stories he had never told. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, unaware that what James Whittaker was about to reveal would turn Margaret's story end. Thomas's understanding of her completely on its head, asterisk. James Whittaker studied Thomas for a long moment before setting down the small piece of wood he'd been sanding. His movements were unhurried, but his gaze was sharp, like someone who had spent years measuring the weight of strangers' intentions before letting them in. "You're not from around here," James said finally, his voice low and rough, as though every word had to be pushed through gravel. "No," Thomas admitted, stepping into the shed. The air smelled of sawdust and cold metal. "My name's Thomas. I think you knew my wife." Her name was Margaret. Margaret Lewis. At the mention of the name, something flickered across James's face, an almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw, followed by a deep, steady breath. "Margaret," he repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word after years of silence. "She passed away 2 years ago," Thomas continued, feeling his throat tighten. "I found a letter she wrote. It was addressed to the man I have never met, but think of every day. I believe she meant you." James's eyes dropped to the floor. He reached for a stool and sat heavily, as if his legs could no longer hold him. For a moment, he said nothing, the only sound the faint rustle of wind against the shed walls. "She was my daughter," James said at last. "I've known it every day of my life since the day I left." Thomas's breath caught. Admission was both expected and shocking. "Why?" He asked the question sharper than he intended. "Why did you leave her? Why never come back?" James rubbed his palms together slowly, as though trying to warm them against an old cold. "Your wife's mother, Eleanor, was the love of my life. But when I came back from Vietnam, I wasn't the man she'd married. I was angry. I drank too much. I hurt people without meaning to. When Eleanor told me she was pregnant, I thought the best thing I could do for them was disappear before I ruined them too." Thomas's mind flashed to Margaret's quiet strength, the way she always carried herself with a kind of self-contained grace. She had never spoken of this man, yet now here he was, haunted by the very absence he had chosen. "I tried to find them once," James continued, his voice growing unsteady, "about 10 years later. But by then, they'd moved. I didn't know where, and I told myself maybe it was better. Maybe Margaret had grown up thinking I was dead rather than knowing the truth." Thomas pulled the photograph from his pocket and set it on the workbench. "She kept this," he said quietly. "All these years she wanted to meet you. She forgave you." James's hand hovered over the photograph but didn't touch it, as though afraid it might vanish. His eyes glistened, but he blinked the tears away. "She forgave me without ever hearing my side. She didn't need to," Thomas said. "She just wanted you to know she didn't hate you. That she wondered what your voice sounded like." For the first time, James's composure cracked. He pressed a hand over his mouth, shoulders shaking once before he steadied himself. "I have something," James said suddenly. He rose and crossed the shed, opening an old metal toolbox. From the bottom, he pulled out a small sealed envelope, its edges frayed from years of handling. "I wrote this in case I ever found her, but I never did. If you'll allow it, I'd like you to have it." Thomas accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Across the front, in neat block letters, were the words, "For Margaret." "If we meet, I don't know if reading it will help you," James said, "but maybe it will help her memory." Thomas slipped the envelope into his coat. Key didn't open. If they're not in front of James, and not yet. Some things needed the right place, the right moment. As Thomas left the farm, the sky had darkened, and a cold wind swept down the road. He glanced in the rearview mirror once, catching a final glimpse of James standing in the driveway, one hand raised in a hesitant wave. Thomas didn't yet know that the letter in his pocket didn't just hold an apology. It held a confession that would change how he saw Margaret's entire life. Thomas waited until he was home to open James's letter. The house felt heavier that evening, as though it too was aware of the weight of what he carried. He sat at the kitchen table, the one where he and Margaret had shared countless meals, and placed the envelope in front of him. For several minutes, he simply stared at it, hearing the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old pipes. When he finally slid a knife under the flap, the paper released a faint, musty scent, tears of waiting compressed into a single breath. The letter inside was written in block capitals, the pen strokes firm but uneven, as if each word had cost effort to contain. Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I failed you twice, once by leaving, and again by not finding you sooner. Thomas swallowed hard and kept going. When I came back from Vietnam, I wasn't fit to be anyone's father. The things I'd done, the things I'd seen, they made me dangerous. Thought I was protecting you by staying away. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the shame of facing you. The letter grew darker, more confessional. James wrote about the nightmares, the drinking, the fights. He told of one night years after Margaret was born when he went looking for Eleanor, desperate to see his daughter. But what he found instead was something Thomas had never heard before. I saw you, Margaret. You were about 7, holding your mother's hand as you crossed the street. I was standing in the shadows, afraid to step forward. You looked up at her and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could have made a man whole again. I wanted to call out to you, but there was another man there holding a bag of groceries, laughing with your mother. I realized she had moved on. She had found someone who could give you the life I couldn't. So I turned away. Thomas froze. Margaret had never mentioned any father figure other than her mother. She had always said it was just the two of us. Had she known about this man? Had she kept it from him? Or had Eleanor kept it from her? The letter ended with a plea. If you ever do want to meet me, I will not hide again. I can't give you back the years, but I can give you the truth. And whatever pieces of me are left. Thomas set the letter down, his pulse quickening. The other man James had seen it didn't fit with what he knew of Margaret's childhood. There had been no stepfather, no stories of anyone else in the picture, which meant either James had mistaken someone for Eleanor's partner, or there was a chapter of Margaret's past she had chosen to erase. Unable to sit still, Thomas went back up to the attic. He searched the chest again, this time emptying every compartment, every envelope. At the very bottom, behind a stack of school notebooks, he found a small tin box locked with a simple latch. Inside were photographs he'd never seen. Margaret as a girl, not just with Eleanor, but with a tall man whose face was partially shadowed in each image. As if deliberately avoiding the camera. One photo caught his attention, Margaret on her 8th birthday, blowing out candles while the man's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, were 3 words, "For when I'm ready." Thomas sat back on his heels, the pieces starting to form a shape he didn't yet understand. The letter from James had opened one door, but behind it was another, leading to a part of Margaret's life that neither her father nor her husband had ever been invited into, and something told him that finding out the truth might not bring the comfort he thought it would. Thomas didn't sleep that night. The tin box sat open on the coffee table, the photographs spread out like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Each image seemed to whisper a version of Margaret he had never met, a little girl with a man who wasn't James, smiling as if the world were simple and safe by dawn. He decided he needed answers from the only person who could still give them, Eleanor. He drove to her small apartment across town, the morning air sharp in his lungs. Eleanor answered the door slowly, her silver hair pulled back, her eyes narrowing when she saw the photographs in his hands. "I found these in the attic," Thomas said, stepping inside. "And I've spoken to James." Her face tightened at the name. "James Whitaker is not the man you should be chasing," she said firmly, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Then who is this?" Thomas held up the photo of Margaret on her birthday, 'cause he's in nearly every picture from when she was a child. Eleanor sat down heavily, the chair creaking under her. She stared at the photograph for a long time before speaking. His name was David Rourke. He wasn't Margaret's father, not by blood, but he loved her like she was. Kay came into our lives when she was 6. For 2 years, he was everything James wasn't. Steady, kind, sober. Margaret adored him. Then why have I never heard his name? Thomas asked. Because one night, he didn't come home, Eleanor said quietly. There was a car accident. He was gone instantly. Margaret was 8, and after that, she wouldn't speak his name. She put away every photograph, every memory. She said she didn't want to lose him a second time by talking about him. Thomas felt the truth settle. Over him, Margaret had grown up with 2 fathers, one who left by choice and one who was taken by fate. And in her letter to James, she hadn't just been forgiving a man she'd never met, she had been reaching for the ghost of both men. The missing pieces of herself. Eleanor's eyes softened. She was ready to tell you, I think. Maybe she was waiting for the right moment, but she didn't get it. When Thomas left Eleanor's apartment, the winter sun was just breaking through the clouds. He drove without thinking until he found himself back at James's farmhouse. James opened the door, surprise flickering across his face. Back so soon? I know about David, Thomas said. Margaret had someone who filled the space, you. Left for a while, but she still kept a place for you in her heart. She forgave you, James, and I think she wanted you to forgive yourself too. James's eyes glistened, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide it. I don't deserve that kind of grace, he murmured. Maybe not, Thomas said, but it's yours anyway. They stood in silence, the wind rustling the bare branches outside. Then Thomas reached into his coat and handed James the photograph of himself in uniform. She kept this safe her whole life. I think it belongs with you now. James took it with trembling hands, his lips parting in a soundless thank you as Thomas drove away. He realized the letter he had found in the attic had given him something unexpected. Not just the truth about Margaret's past, but a final gift from her, reminder that love is rarely tidy, that forgiveness is often undeserved, and that the people we lose still shape the people we become. That night, Thomas placed the tin box back in the attic, the photographs neatly arranged. But he kept the picture of Margaret on her 8th birthday on the mantle. She was blowing out her candles, eyes bright, frozen in the moment between wishing and knowing. And Thomas decided he didn't need to know what she wished for. He already had the answer. Asterisk, if this story has reached you today, I hope it reminds you of something important. We all carry pieces of the past that no one else can see. Some are painful, some are precious, and some are a tangled mix of both. For Thomas, the discovery of that old letter didn't just reveal hidden truths, it became a bridge between people separated by decades of silence, regret, and unanswered questions. Maybe you've got a letter in the attic of your own something, unsaid, unresolved, tucked away because you didn't know how to face it. Maybe there's someone you haven't spoken to in years, someone you've written off as too far gone, or someone you think wouldn't want to hear from you. But sometimes, the truth isn't as dangerous as we imagine, and the cost of not reaching out is far greater than the fear of rejection. Margaret never got to meet her father. She never got to hand him the forgiveness she'd already decided to give. But her love, quiet, steadfast, and unconditional, still found its way to him through the hands of someone who loved her deeply. And that is something we can all choose to do. To carry the love forward even when the person who started it is gone. So maybe today is the day you make that call, send that letter, knock on that door. Not because you're guaranteed a perfect ending, but because you'll know you tried. Because love left unspoken is still love, but love spoken aloud has the power to change everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might. Need a reminder that it's never too late for truth or for forgiveness. And if you've got a story of your own of reconciliation, of letting go, or of finding someone you thought you'd lost forever, I'd love to hear it because in the end, we are all someone's unfinished letter.